Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter podcast. I'm Dan Schneider, joined as always by my co-host Nick Filato. And yes, it is actually the Big Blue Banter New York Giants football podcast. I apologize. I'm coming fresh off of two back-to-back recordings of podcasts, not for this show, for Fantasy Football Today. Check it out, CBS Sports, if you like fantasy football. But brain's a little scrambled. But we wanted to come back on and talk a little bit about the last couple of days of training camp practices. That's Thursday, August 3rd practice. And then today's Friday morning's practice. One was padded, the Friday one was not padded practice on Thursday. And there's been a little bit of a rash of injuries. So far, so good in the sense that they're not anything crazy. We've had big injuries for other teams already. Obviously, Jalen Ramsey being the biggest so far, unfortunately, for the Dolphins. I don't think any of these two are big yet, but they're interesting because they're two of the most important players on the roster for the Giants at this point. So let's start by getting into some injuries. Here's the quick update on these injuries. Evan Neal is officially in the concussion protocol. He suffered a concussion at practice. We'll get into that in a bit. Darren Waller had to get his fingers taped up after a blocking mishap. I do not believe there's any designation on that. He did not return to practice. Hopefully not broken fingers, because in my opinion, that would obviously impact his ability to catch the football. We don't know anything there. But I don't love that one. I don't love finger injuries for receiving options. But I don't think it's too crazy. Leonard Williams now missed 2 straight practices. Maybe rest day for veteran. I think it would be more interesting if it was, or less interesting if it was one day. The 2 days in a row is a little scary, but not too scary yet. He obviously is someone who I have my eye on from an injury standpoint after playing through almost all of last season with an injury, sapped his effectiveness, didn't even really report the injury till later in the season. You know he was playing through it, but he didn't report it. That happens a lot with Giants players and athletes across the NFL. Not every injury gets reported. Not every injury hits the injury report. A lot of these players are playing through things that they don't discuss, talk about, you may never find out about. This is a true fact about it. So we have those. And then we had some injuries from Thursday's practice. Nick, you want to get us caught up there?
Ryder Anderson fell awkwardly on his tricep, and as of right now, Brian Daboll hasn't said he's going to be out for an extended period of time or not, but he's out right now. He was not at practice. In terms of Leonard Williams, I do think that's a load management issue. I welcome it. Look, Leonard Williams, everyone can benefit from training camp, but this is somebody who, if you have him healthy, he is going to be a very good football player for you. I still believe he has that. He just turned 30, or he's about to turn 30 years old. He plays on the defensive line. You just got to ensure that he stays healthy. And the Giants are just bringing in defensive linemen. They just brought in Donovan Jeter, a guy who went to the University of Michigan. D. Jeter went to the University of Michigan, who does not play shortstop for the New York Yankees. They brought him in because Jeff Smith, the wide receiver special teamer, was waived with some sort of injury. I'm not 100% certain. I don't know if it has been disclosed yet what happened to Jeff Smith, but Jeff Smith has been waived and Donovan Jeter came in. So they have this deep pool of defensive linemen. We're not certain who's going to make the team, but Ryder Anderson, he's injured, and Leonard Williams, his overall load seems to be managed, which I'm okay with.
Yeah, you got to manage that load, don't you?
Got to manage that load.
Yeah. And further, by the way, just a quick aside. There was a weird YouTube comment recently about someone saying that I am purposely wearing tight shirts and quote unquote pushing my biceps up, which I've never heard that term before in my life. So if you've noticed on this stream, I have positioned the camera to hide my quote unquote pushed up biceps. And I feel like it's a pretty loose shirt for the most part here. So hopefully I can make your day better by, I'm pushing up my biceps there, whatever the hell that means. But trust me, that's not me.
Speaking of the shirt, though, dude, we have to acknowledge this for the YouTube audience. Dan and I have been simpatico. This is the second time in 2 weeks that Dan and I showed up on this podcast with similar designed shirts. And we did not plan this at all. I have a Red Hot Chili Peppers black-based shirt with their primary logo. Dan has a black-based shirt. It has red on it as well. It looks similar to the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Band Kickers shirt. That's what this is. Band Kickers from Fantasy
I was going to ask
you. Band Kickers. Jake Seeley. He's the one who spearheads the movement. We don't want kickers in fantasy football. Pointless. They don't carry over year to year. The rankings mean nothing. They're random. Yeah. It's luck-based. Band kickers.
Yeah, kickers are horrible.
We have enough variance in fantasy football game. We don't need to add more variance.
I'm not going to lie, though. You could take advantage of kickers if you know what you're doing. Just going after the high over-under. Going after the high over-under.
Do it on a weekly basis by going after the high over-unders and the home kickers, I believe it is also part of it.
But dome kickers.
Yes, dome kickers. But on a season-long basis, that's when it's stupid. In the draft is 100%. When it's stupid. Yeah.
100%. Okay. And people take them in like the 9th round. It's like terrible. It's like, what are you doing?
If you find any league where that's still happening, please invite me immediately.
Some of my leagues.
Buy-in for that league. Yeah. Jesus Christ. I'm playing that any day. All right. Let's get back to the Giants. Let's get back to some practice notes. Before we get into both of these practices, I want to talk about some things that have stood out to me from a depth chart standpoint, Nick, and get your thoughts on it. We're starting to see a little bit of a steady drumbeat, if you want to call it that, building as far as players that are returning to the first team day after day after day. And I want to talk about 3 specifically. The first one being Jason Pinnock, who now has for 4 straight practices, I believe, or 5 straight with today's, been the starting safety. There's no rotation. Bobby McCain's not rotating with him. You don't see McLeod out there. It's Pinnock. Another guy who's same case, John Michael Schmitz, Giants second round pick, has now had 4 straight, I believe 4 or 5 straight practices as a first team center. And then the last example of that is an interesting one. Another rookie, Trey Hawkins, who has now been playing almost exclusively with the ones as a starting outside corner opposite Deonte Banks, with Adoree Jackson kicking inside to the slot. So let's tackle those one by one and see which ones are most interesting to us. Let's start with Pinnock, who's been playing safety now exclusively with the first team.
Brian Dable, he likes to cycle in his players, get different matchups on offense and different matchups on defense. So you're going to see some players who more than likely won't earn first team snaps start one practice, but usually it doesn't carry over to the second practice, or usually is a cycle. Jason Pinnock's case, it's not cyclical because he has been the starter for 5 straight practices now. And it's not like the Giants are either injured at the safety position or don't have the depth to actually fill that void next to Xavier McKinney, because you have Bobby McCain, you have Dane Belton, you have players who can actually start on the New York Giants, not named Jason Pinnock, and he's the one who's starting. So I'm starting to evaluate this. I still think it's going to be a platoon. I do, but who is going to be out there for those first snaps in base personnel? It might be Jason Pinnock, not just the one-handed interception, which went viral around NFL media. It's above that. It seems like everyone in the building is speaking positively about Jason Pinnock. And as we brought up on the last podcast, he's only 24 years old with some elite athletic testing in terms of 10-yard split, which we know is so important to Wink Martindale. And as Jason Pinnock said himself, he's like, I was blitzing a lot last year, but I can do more than just blitz. And I think Wink Martindale is starting to realize that, and he might have the shot to fill that Julian Love type of role. Again, I still think it's going to be somewhat of a platoon.
I think Jason Pinnock's a really interesting prospect that's not getting discussed enough for the reasons you mentioned, the athletic profile, the fact that, look, it went viral. It's cool, the one-hand interception, but when you can show that you can do that on tape, it shows a different level of actual functional athleticism to be able to stab that ball out of the air, off balance, and make a one-handed play on the interception on the ball like that. I also think when you bring up things like the 10-yard split, you look at his history playing cornerback position, that gives him the coverage skill set that I think is interesting there. It kind of starts to feel like he could be one of the sleepers for the Giants this year. And we look at every year, Nick and I will do a podcast as we get closer to the season on breakouts, busts, sleepers type thing for the Giants. Probably won't include busts. We never do. We just do breakouts and sleepers. Try to keep it positive here. But we'll look at breakouts. We'll look at sleepers. Pinnock's probably going to make that list for me because there's a lot of factors in play here that I don't think are being discussed enough. 2 of what you brought up, and then again, that coverage skill set he already brings to the table. I kind of look at the safety group right now, and I think he has by far and away the most upside outside of Xavier McKinney. So I actually think he can fill that Julian Love role. And for me, Nick, I got to be honest with you, I think there's a chance he could bring more to the role than Julian Love did. I wasn't a huge fan of Love last year, I guess, as much as some other people. I thought he was consistent. I thought he was in the right spot at the right time a lot of the time, but I didn't think he filled the alley like some of the past Giants safeties, Jabril Peppers and players like that, just Landon Collins. And I think Pinnock can probably be that presence in the alley, that really physical guy who's going to crash downhill and make teams think differently about how they want to scheme against the Giants on those outside runs that killed the Giants last year. I did not feel like Julian Love made teams scheme that differently. In coverage, I didn't feel like Julian Love was doing that great in the deep half, and I didn't think he made too many plays in the deep half. Maybe Pinnock can, maybe he can't, but that to me would just be gravy. If he can add that consistent presence in the alley as a defender, I think he's already potentially providing an upgrade if, of course, he can be as consistently smart as Love. That's what a lot of what Love brought to the table was the IQ stuff that can't always be measured, but he's in the right place at the right time. If Pinnock is a similar guy, taking the right angles in the place at the right time, I think he could be a real sleeper for the Giants this year, so I'm starting to get pretty excited about him.
Julian Love led the New York Giants in interceptions last season. How dare you?
Yeah, with what, 2?
With 2, exactly. The New York Giants were terrible. Jason Pinnock can show his ability to process and position himself like Love did with his athletic traits, because Pinnock might be a better athlete than Julian Love. He's a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit more physical than Julian Love. Then you're right. In terms of filling the alley, like Jabril Peppers, Landon Collins, they had some issues, specifically in coverage. Julian Love was much better than them in coverage. In terms of filling the alley, though, those guys were elite in that area. If Pinnock can even come to like a 75% of what Landon Collins was, which is saying a lot because Collins was elite at this, then you're talking about a true enforcer with the addition of Bobby Okereke and all of the upgrades the Giants made on the defensive line. The 28th ranked rush defense last season was the New York Giants. If Pinnock can be that alley defender, or at least 75% of what Landon Collins was, maybe even 65%, then you're talking about a just true physical force that's going to take that rush defense to a completely different level. I would say Julian Love was very, very good in terms of positioning himself in the alley. He didn't maybe have to pop on contact, but I don't remember many instances, maybe we disagree here, where Julian Love was getting faked out in the alley. The
No,
one game that he really sucked, though, was I think the last game against the Eagles. That was the one game where I think he had like 4 or 5 missed tackles. I don't have it in front of me. But other than that, I think he only had like 2 or 3 missed tackles on the entire season.
Yeah, I completely agree. It wasn't a missed tackle issue for me. It was more of just the physical presence, getting downhill fast, making plays in the backfield. I didn't really remember him making too many tackles for loss or plays in the backfield. I think maybe Pinnock can bring that, because another thing I want to talk about, we're starting to see more in practices, is the re-addition or the rejuvenation, whatever you want to call it, of more dime packages. And that means 3 safeties on the field. We've seen the look with McKinney, Pinnock, and Dane Belton. And we've seen that more and more in the last few practices. I am a big believer in Belton as well. I think Belton can play the role nice in the deep half. They can use Pinnock around the line of scrimmage, like you mentioned, as like a pseudo linebacker type of player, crashing downhill. Then McKinney can be used to match up against the tight ends, match up against the slots, play a robber role, things of that nature. And I kind of like that package a lot, which takes Beavers or McFadden off the field. And partially, Beavers and McFadden have been rotating pretty evenly, I think. Some people who have been at Giants camp, I think it was Albert Breer or maybe it was Peter King, were raving, or no, it wasn't either of those two. It was actually Brett Coleman did a podcast recently on the Giants, which I would suggest you take the time to listen to it if you want to, Nick. It's like the only we always talk about off pod, Nick, how we feel like the national media just has such a bad viewpoint of the Giants because they don't watch the tape and they're just like so off on so many opinions. I actually felt listening to that podcast with Coleman that no outside media has ever hit the Giants 2022 or what they actually were better than this group. And they were really good at it. And so they clearly
listened. I've heard that podcast, but they were using actual like advanced statistics to break down the New York Giants. A lot of other people are just like, Daniel Jones sucks and Saquon Barkley is good. Like they have no clue. They're just live football pours. They don't actually watch the tape. Brett Coleman watches the tape and he uses advanced statistics. And that's why I respect his opinion.
Yeah, me too. And they were really high on that podcast on Micah McFadden. I didn't see it as much as they did on the tape, but the way
they were talking about his Indiana days. I think that's what they were referring to. Maybe I misheard, but I thought they were saying we liked him as a prospect coming out of Indiana, I think is what they said.
Yeah, they expanded a little bit on that though. They were discussing about like used terms that I thought were a little interesting about what his upside would be, but we'll see what happens there. But in my opinion, getting him or Beavers off the field and putting those 3 safeties is probably the best scenario for the Giants moving forward. I mean, they're not going to do it every snap. It's all dependent on personnel you're facing, matching up against their personnel, down and distance, all the things Wink puts into that. But I like to see the dime package moving, and I like to see them starting to get it rolling here with Belton, Pinnock, and McKinney. I think that's probably the best trio they have there for the dime package.
If Jason Pinnock or any of these safeties can operate in the box and actually execute run fits like a linebacker, then you're going to see more of those dime packages, because the linebackers last year were not great at lever, spill, lever type of ways to dictate their defense.
What is lever, spill, lever for the
lever, spill, lever is when the defensive linemen or the linebackers, and it's different from even and odd fronts. Giants run a lot of odd front type of defenses, but when they're in nickel, they run even front. Lever, spill, lever is basically just how the linebackers flow and how the safety fills. Lever means you're going to take the outside portion of that lead blocker and you're going to try to force the run inside, and then spill means to try to spill everything outside. So you're trying to spill everybody outside to that free safety or that strong safety who's going to be coming down into the alley. The linebackers last year for the Giants, I don't think I've ever used that term before on the podcast, but that's what so many teams are trying to do, is just execute that against power type of teams. You want to take that backside guard who's pulling and you want to cut him off. And what you do with, say, like the 5 technique in that situation, you're going to slant him inside, the tackle's going to block down, and then you need that play side linebacker to lever the first puller, and then you need the other linebacker to spill out if the safety is going to be coming down, say, from like a 2 high. It really depends on what kind of defense you're running, and I could probably break it down more during the season when we go over plays and stuff like that. But we went over so many plays last season that showed that, right? And the Giants were terrible at it. We would just refer to it as scraping over the top. But it's also containing when you need to contain and spilling when you need to spill, also known as boxing and containing, or boxing and spilling, which are kind of terms we've used a lot throughout the podcast. But the Giants last season were terrible at lever, spill, lever. if any of those safeties can, then you can align those safeties in the box like the Giants were doing in lighter packages with Landon Collins. And he had his ups and downs, but he was still a physical presence. But if Pinnock, who has solid size, if he can actually take the right angles, position himself well to eliminate those pullers, power gap concepts, then the continuity of the defense is going to be upheld. And that's what did the Giants in last season. They had no continuity in terms of playing power gap.
That's a great point. And we'll have to see if those guys can do that. I think Pinnock has the upside to do it. Now, obviously, you got to put it into play and watch him actually do that. Because I do think, like what you just said, will require a bit of projection because we will, in that scenario, be seeing Pinnock in a slightly different role this year than he was last year. Obviously, we discussed this earlier. He's mostly just kind of a blitzer. I think that's good, though. Like, I think he can take on that role, I think, Jason Pinnock, and I think he can probably do a good job with it. I'm very excited about him potentially. Let's get to the second development we talked about there, which is John Michael Schmitz playing basically exclusively now as the first team center. I guess no real surprises there for you, right?
No, he had to play against Jordan Riley. It's against Jordan Riley. This is a 7th round pick. Let's keep everything in mind. And this is something we liked about him. He was very flexible in all of his joints in his lower body because he absorbs the contact. And to Riley's credit, Riley gets lower than him and tries to lift up that center of gravity of John Michael Schmitz. But you see John Michael Schmitz just kind of trusting his technique, absorbing the contact, keeping everything tight, keeping everything close, and then setting back on his hips. And you look at his ankle joints, they're like in the ground, and it's at this awkward angle that looks like not a lot of people can bend that way, but there's no stress in John Michael Schmitz. He just takes on and absorbs that power. And to Jordan Riley's credit, he's a very powerful player, not much of a pass rusher, but in these one-on-one situations, you really got to contain that power. You need to absorb that power. John Michael Schmitz did so very well. It's just Dexter Lawrence. When you're going up against Dexter Lawrence a lot, I think you're going to have an easier time with players like Jordan Riley.
And that was one thing I loved about Schmitz when we were breaking him down like before the draft, because obviously I was higher on Tippmann for the Giants because of what I thought he could bring to the run game on the move. But I didn't think that Tippmann was the better prospect overall in some ways. And in one major way was the one you just said. I felt like John Michael Schmitz had a stronger base and he had a much better center of gravity and ability to absorb that contact. And he's going to need to have that in the NFC East. That's the key thing. Like, you put Joe Tippmann on the line starting day one, and I could already see examples of like some of these D tackles in the East just like totally abusing him in the pass rush game, and seeing similar things to what we saw with Evan Neal from a balance issue standpoint in pass pro. With John Michael Schmitz, that might not be the case. He might be able to absorb the contact, like you said, and just get in front of the defender, almost like a in some ways how Charles Cross won. Obviously different positions, but similar to how Cross won, just by like staying in front of that defender at all times. And that's something I'm going to keep an eye on too. And I like that point by you.
Let's revisit after the draft. What did we say? We loved those first 3 picks. We were in love with them. We said Deonte Banks and John Michael Schmitz, though, might both struggle in year 1, and that's okay. They're rookies. The NFL is hard on cornerbacks. It's going to be hard on centers in the NFC East, is what we said, because look at all the defensive linemen here. Then look at Jalin Hyatt. We were like, Jalin Hyatt, look, we might not be able to release off the line of scrimmage, run routes. We just haven't seen it yet, was our main sticking point. But we loved his speed, and we thought his ball tracking and all the things that he has shown in camp so far. We love that. We saw that on his Tennessee film, but we just didn't know how it was going to translate. So far in camp, some of these are 7-on-7, some of these are 1-on-1s, but he is exceeding the expectations that we believed he had in year 1 already. Now, can he translate that? Can he be consistent with that? I hope. But damn, dude, I know we're talking about John Michael Schmitz and we're going through our notes here, and Jalin Hyatt wasn't necessarily someone that we had in there to talk about just yet, but I just wanted to acknowledge that he's already exceeding what we expected, and that makes me really excited.
Yeah, Jalin Hyatt is the number 1 riser right now in Giants camp. Back-to-back days, long touchdown passes, catches. He's winning consistently with his speed. He's creating separation, and or the Giants are putting him in position to get easy separation off the line of scrimmage. Whatever may be the case, I don't care. If you're coaching it to the point where, and you're scheming it to the point where he's able to create that quick release, that separation off the line of scrimmage, I don't care how it's done. I don't need him to beat press coverage every play. I just need the Giants to put him in position where he can get going on the vertical plane and create separation. And that's what we're seeing in camp. And not only is he creating that separation, but he's actually coming down with the catches and making the big explosive plays. And that's something we just haven't seen a lot in Giants camp in the last few years. We just, thinking back, like, we have not seen a lot of explosive pass plays in camp. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that translates 1-to-1 in the games. It certainly was the case last year where we didn't see explosive pass plays in camp. We didn't see him in the preseason. We didn't see him in the regular season. It doesn't necessarily mean we see him now in camp. We see him in the preseason. We see him in the regular season moving forward. We hope that's the case, but it certainly can't be a bad thing. And we're starting to see those. And a big factor in those, Slayton's had a few of them. Campbell's had a few. Hyatt's had a few now. Hyatt's had a lot of them, and Hyatt's playing a lot with the first team. So that's something that's definitely intrigued me as well. And I think there's an actual chance that Hyatt could be a much bigger factor year one than me and you were personally ever expecting before camp.
Geez, would that be welcome, dude?
We need it. Yeah, it would be huge for the Giants. All right, let's talk about the last thing that I brought up there in the secondary, which is Trey Hawkins getting a lot of first-team reps now as that outside corner. What do you make of that? What do you think about Adoree moving over to the slot? How does that fit his skill set in your mind?
I think Adoree Jackson is probably the quickest cornerback the Giants have. And if he's okay with it, which he is, I mean, you listen to him, he's like, hey, whatever the team needs. He's very team oriented for a player who's entering a contract year, which is, there's something to be said about that. Maybe we'll have to monitor it, but I would love to see Adoree Jackson inside if Trey Hawkins can handle the outside responsibilities. I'm not sold that he can. I love what I've seen from Trey Hawkins, but to suggest that he can handle those responsibilities week one against the Dallas Cowboys, that's a huge step. He needs to show a lot. Remember, just 2 years ago, we were singing the praises of Rodarius Williams. Now, he ended up getting hurt early in the season, but he had some playing time early in 2021, and it wasn't all that great once the regular season rolled around. Speed is different. The scheming is different. You're circled by the offensive coordinator, so there's so much pressure on you. And if you have two starting rookies on the outside, both Deonte Banks, Trey Hawkins, they're going to get picked on like crazy. So I think there will be certain packages where the Giants may flirt with it if Trey Hawkins continues to maintain a high level of play throughout training camp, throughout preseason, into the regular season. Say maybe against Dallas Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb's in the slot. The Giants might feel comfortable enough to move Adoree Jackson into the slot to cover him. I don't think it's going to be a mainstay. It's not going to be something that's going to be an every game plan type of thing. I think it's only going to be specific, and that still is like a 99th percentile outcome for Trey Hawkins.
Yeah, and for the Giants too, because we would be in a great position if that's the case. Things I like about it, idea-wise, like from an overall standpoint, I think Adoree Jackson showed a lot as far as crashing down on the line of scrimmage on quick passes and in the run game. So I like having him in the slot for that reason.
Great point.
I also like the matchup reason. A lot of the wide receiver ones the Giants are facing are like the CeeDee Lamb types where you're going to be operating out of the slot. Now you get Adoree Jackson in the slot. You get your best corner in the slot to face off again. I think I prefer that to a Cordell Flott right now who can't seem to grasp the position to a full. Like he's still making plays in camp. It's not like Flott is having a bad camp, but he's mixed in and out with the starters. He hasn't done like the Pinnock or the John Michael Schmitz where you've rised all the way through the depth chart where you're every day getting those first team reps. So I do like that factor as well. Just specifically thinking of that Dallas matchup week one, but we'll get to that obviously as it gets closer, but definitely intriguing to me because I've always thought Adoree Jackson could be even better potentially in the slot. And the Giants never really had the opportunity to do that because they didn't have any outside corner depth. Now it's starting to feel like they feel a little more comfortable with the outside corner depth, at least this early on in camp with Hawkins, with Banks on the outside. And maybe that does lead to Adoree Jackson getting more slot snaps, which to me, again, could be a good thing.
And it also gives the Giants those options because I think Darnay Holmes is one of those players on the roster, as we've said, who is, when it comes down to cuts, he might be out just because of the price tag if he doesn't take a reduction in pay. So now you have Adoree Jackson if Cordell Flott doesn't work out. And if you could trust Trey Hawkins or Amani Oruwariye maybe on the outside, then it just gives you that option to align that way. That's all we're looking for right now. They're testing a bunch of different players in a bunch of different scenarios against a bunch of different other personnel to see how they react. You just want Kafka and Martindale to have different options. So when week one arises, whatever the Cowboys throw at the Giants, they have some sort of plan to handle it.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other notes I want to bring up before we get into a little discussion about the offensive line, because there are some interesting things developing on the offensive line outside of John Michael Schmitz just starting 5 practices in a row, which is interesting in its own right. But some more interesting things have happened. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about Colin Johnson here, who we haven't discussed that much. But what I'm recently reading out of these camp reports is that Colin Johnson's basically the go-to guy for Tyrod Taylor in that second offense. 8-target day 2 days ago, Thursday's practice, which is insane. I think 8 catch or 8-target day, just either way, insane volume. And when that happens, when you're going through these practices and you have a quarterback, even if it's second team offense, first team, it doesn't really make a difference for the point I'm trying to make. When that starts to happen, there's a reason it's happening. It's because the quarterback has confidence in you. You've built the rapport, and the quarterback trusts you to make the plays when the ball comes your way, no matter what the coverage is, no matter where you're at that point in your route. They're throwing with anticipation, throwing to a spot. It's starting to happen with Colin Johnson. It's showing me that Colin Johnson is creating separation, showing me Colin Johnson is coming away with the catches that are around his catch radius. He's not dropping passes. He's not missing assignments. It's interesting to me, Nick, because it's like they are so crowded right now at wide receiver, which is something we didn't have last year. Colin Johnson's a really interesting player that I don't know if he's going to make the roster because of the special teams aspect of it, but it's almost like you're going to miss out on a potential impact contributor if you do cut him. And I'm just curious to get your take on if you've thought about at all just Johnson's work with the second team and how he's kind of really producing a lot right now with Tyrod Taylor's group.
Earlier in training camp, he had that one-handed touchdown thrown by Daniel Jones. So it's not just the second team. Look, the Giants wide receiver, they're the slot machine. It's what we've said, right? They're very small, but you have Isaiah Hodgins and then Colin Johnson and Bryce Ford-Wheaton. I still think it's going to come down to Colin Johnson and Bryce Ford-Wheaton. I think the Giants are somewhat incentivized. They're a meritocracy, but they're somewhat incentivized to want to keep someone like Bryce Ford-Wheaton since they spent that much on his signing bonus, and you have him under contract longer than a player like Colin Johnson, who tore his Achilles last year. But this is somebody who just keeps rising to the occasion. Colin Johnson last year, great training camp, great preseason, ended up unfortunately getting injured. Right now, making waves in camp with Tyrod Taylor, and when he has the opportunity so far, to my understanding with the first team, he's also making plays. We just saw Jeff Smith get injured. I think you look at some of the wide receivers on the Giants, Cole Beasley, Jamison Crowder, Sterling Shepard, they're all older, more slot type of guys who could possibly be more prone to injury because they're a little bit older if their reps aren't managed properly. Brian Daboll has been doing a really good job managing reps, though. You do want these big-bodied wide receivers for certain packages. We talk about options. Other than Isaiah Hodgins, there's no one else who's big other than Bryce Ford-Wheaton and Colin Johnson. I think there's going to be a roster spot determined by those two specifically.
Yeah, I like that take a lot. And I'm excited to see the preseason, Nick, because training camp's one thing. There's practices. There's no pads for most of these. There's no pass rush. It's a lot of this is 7-on-7 drills, which to me are not great to be going off the stats. When we get the preseason tape, we're going to start to see how this offense moves and how the passing game evolves and which receivers are actually contributing in game situations. And last year, we even saw a game, I believe, if I remember right, where Daboll threw the ball like 40 times in a preseason game. I think, like, in general, Daboll doesn't care that much about running the ball in preseason. If I remember back from last year, he's trying to, like, work out the kinks in the passing game. And I'm excited to just see all these receivers actually contribute in games and then I'll get a better feel for who's going to make the roster and who should make the roster.
You got to think, why is Brian Daboll doing that? Because he wants to know if these receivers can get on the same page with the quarterback and be where they're supposed to be based on the coverage the defense shows. So it's a really great way to evaluate wide receivers against different defenses that they have not seen yet.
Yeah, well, a great way to do it is just keep throwing. Call pass play, call pass play, call pass play. They practice the running game. I feel like they're going to run a lot. Not a lot. They'll probably mix it in, but some of what they're going to run in the run game this year is a lot of what they already did last year. They're not going to reinvent the wheel the same way that the passing game, on the other hand, like you said, if they're repping it a certain way and if the receivers are getting to a certain point, they might be expanding the passing game a lot this year from a schematic standpoint. I think it will be expanded a lot from it, which is really exciting to think about.
Especially with the way the room is constructed right now, where you're going to have to release maybe one or two players who could be pretty solid contributors for you in 2023. You might have to cut them just because there's so many bodies in the wide receiver room. So you really want to get the film on them to see who best fits your offense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, let's talk about a little bit of the development on the depth chart on the offensive line here, which I think is interesting. We've talked about John Michael Schmitz repping out a ton with the first team, basically only with the first team now, center. But there's an interesting development. Mark Lewinsky, who we've talked about in the past, is that depth chart spot up for grabs? Is it not? I don't know if it is, Nick, but starting to think it might be, because the past few practices, Lewinsky's been working with the second team. Ben Bredesen has had some reps as the first team right guard. Ben Bredesen is at a really interesting camp. The Giants have trusted him to play first team right guard, first team left guard, and first team center at all different times so far in training camp. That's 3 different positions. He's by far and away been the most versatile lineman in camp working with the first team. No other lineman on this roster has played 3 different spots with the first team offensive line so far. Bredesen now has. They've had a couple practices with JMS, Azudu, and Bredesen as the big 3 there on the interior, which I know you and I both believe is probably highest upside, but we also don't believe it should just happen, because upside is not the same. Upside is only one range of, if an outcome, if a range of outcomes is a spectrum that's this wide or this deep, the top of the spectrum, Azudu, Bredesen, Schmitz as your interior guys, doesn't mean that it's going to always hit the top of the spectrum. You could go as far down as here versus maybe a Glowinski Bredesen Schmitz combo or a Glowinski Azudu Schmitz combo that could be probably more in a range like this, a narrower range of outcomes versus the wider range of outcomes. But even so, the Giants are obviously testing out to see, Nick, if they can hit that top range of outcomes right now, because they're giving some reps to that combo of Bredesen, Azudu, and Schmitz. What do you make of that?
I love it. And you just want to give these guys some snaps under their belt, because if something were to even happen to Glowinski, now Bredesen is cross-trained at 3 positions. Honestly, it's excellent news for Ben Bredesen, who we weren't ever scared that he wasn't going to make this roster. His roster spot is pretty secure with the type of versatility that he has, especially now that JC Hassenauer got hurt and he actually has snaps center. And it seems like Joe Shane and Brian Dable and Bobby Johnson trust him at center if something were to ever happen to John Michael Schmitz. I also believe, just because this has kind of been a trend, we talked about trends a little bit earlier, maybe they're actually entertaining Mark Lewinsky being the swing interior offensive lineman who could play left guard and right guard, and Ben Bredesen getting the right guard spot. I lean towards it's more just cross training and seeing what works best, and then they're going to evaluate from there. But much more of an open competition than it did, let's say, even last week, just because we're actually getting Mark Lewinsky riding pine for a little bit and Ben Bredesen stepping into his stead. And we know how consistent Ben Bredesen has been for the Giants. It might not be the flashiest. Are there some mistakes sometimes? Sure. I think Mark Lewinsky is a better overall run blocker. But if you're talking about consistency and pass protection, and that's the one part of the Giants that we want to see expanded, right? Explosive plays, more downfield passing. You're going to need better protection on the right side of the line. That just doesn't come from Evan Neal. It also comes from whoever's playing right guard. And I think Ben Bredesen offers a little bit more upside than, say, someone like Mark Lewinsky in that regard.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see the rise for Bredesen. Bredesen, to me, is somebody who should be in the starting lineup week 1. I don't know if that means at the expense of Azudu or Glowinski, but I believe he probably should be in the starting lineup in week 1, just because I feel more safe, Nick, that he's going to be a little more consistent than both of those players in pass protection. And for me, yes, I want the run game to work great. I think the run game can still work pretty well with Bredesen versus those guys in the run game, even if he offers a little bit less on the move than either of those players. But I'm really focused on getting that pass game right, not messing up things on the interior offensive line in the pass game, not, just the way you see Bredesen work those one-on-ones so far. This is a part of the reason for me, Nick, just watching these one-on-ones. I feel like Bredesen's been by far and away the best interior offensive lineman in these one-on-ones out of all the guys. Obviously, it's a difficult task for some of them who have to face Dexter Lawrence more than others. That's not as easy thing to do. Like, if your sample size is 4 reps against Dexter Lawrence versus a sample size with 0 reps against Dexter Lawrence, sure, it's not a fair comparison to go against the guy who has 4 reps against Dexter, but I just feel like I've seen a little bit more consistency, not just there, but throughout the tape last year with Bredesen in pass protection.
You had a very good rep against Rakeem Nunez-Roches, who is back at practice. I'm not sure if we mentioned that on the podcast at one point, but he's back practicing after he was in the concussion protocol. And Rakeem Nunez-Roches, Nacho, he's not really a pass rusher, but I still just loved how he handled it because he made the initial contact on Nacho. Nacho went right with the bull rush, and you could see, if you look closely, Ben Bredesen makes initial contact with his outside hand, gets the inside hand to steer, and it slows down Nacho. Nacho's trying to explode up low to high and then lift Ben Bredesen. Ben Bredesen doesn't allow that. He gets pushed back a little bit, but then he senses that Nacho is going to another move to the inside. You can see Ben Bredesen anticipate that and then just shift his weight, keeping his feet active and just mirroring Nacho. In a one-on-one, that's difficult, even if Nacho isn't the best pass rusher, but it's still very difficult. You don't have a center to your right. You don't have a tackle to your left. It's you mano-a-mano against a player who is a veteran like Nacho. So I felt like that was a really impressive one-on-one rep for Ben Bredesen.
Completely agree with that. I'm excited about that one and Bredesen as well. Anything else from today's and yesterday's practice that stood out to you depth chart wise, or anything that we might have missed in this?
We did see the special teamers come away with a second team interception. Cam Brown using that length. Look, I guess Cam Brown probably hasn't mastered the run game portion of playing linebacker, but there's always going to be this little part of me. Remember how he was used at Penn State? He was used as a nickel. He was used he was used outside the number sometimes. He was used all over the place for the Nittany Lions. There's a little part of me, Dan, that wishes he got more defensive snaps. I completely understand why he doesn't.
Understand that. Yep.
But that length, 34-inch arms, Dan, that's longer arms than I think every starting offensive lineman that's not a tackle. It might actually be the same as Evan Neal, because I think Evan Neal has 34-inch arms. Off the top of my head,
if I remember. In an ideal world, he should be the Giants' best coverage linebacker. In an ideal world, it's not. He should be getting in passing lanes with his length. It's what I originally envisioned with him, and then blitzing occasionally from that spot, either drop or blitz. But obviously, it's not an ideal world. The Giants don't trust him to set the edge at all, I believe. And they obviously.
And I don't know if he's positioning himself well. Like the rigors of the NFL, especially when you're 6'6", and if you're not certain on where to be, that little slight hesitation, you're going to get blown away by some of these pulling guards. So that's more than likely the reason. But he tipped the pass from, I think it was Tyrod Taylor, it might have been Tommy DeVito, and Carter Coughlin ended up coming down with it. And it was just cool to see that duo, because those guys are actually like really close friends. Funny, actually, a little quick story. Last year before the season, my girlfriend, she was in New York City. She was with like a brother or something like that. And she was like, 2 Giants players are here. And I was like, oh, who? And it was Cam Brown and Carter Coughlin with their wives or their girlfriends or whoever it was. And she took a picture, and I was like, oh shit, it's Cam Brown and Carter Coughlin. I'm like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. And they've both been excellent contributors on special teams. Like, you don't want to forget that those guys make an impact on special teams. Cam Brown, his length, we talk about, maybe it hurts him a little bit as a run defender, but it also helps him a lot in keeping a roster spot on special teams, which is more important to him probably right now.
I think it could be cutthroat though with the depth of the roster right now. It might just be one roster spot between the two. And
we'll do that, by the way. We'll do a 53-man roster prediction probably sooner than later, because we'll do multiple of them. It's going to be really interesting this year to do it, Nick. I'm really excited. This is going to be one of the most fun ones to try to predict in a while, based on like what you just said. This roster is so much deeper than it's been in a while for the Giants. In a long time, I feel like this is the deepest roster they've had in a while.
I want one more thing before we get out of here too. We touched on how Evan Neal is in the concussion protocol and the dislocated finger for Darren Waller. We don't have anything on the Waller thing. Hopefully it's a slight dislocation and he may take a couple practices off and return. It doesn't seem like it's serious, but we'll hold off on that. But with Evan Neal, just because he is in the concussion protocol now, hopefully he comes out of it. You never know with those things. Gotcha. Matt Parrott was the tackle who came in and subbed for him once he got injured. I'm not certain if Corey Cunningham and Devery Hamilton were there at practice, but if Matt Parrott, and we've talked about this, I think recently, is that swing tackle, that's an issue for the New York Giants.
Yes. Surprised it wasn't Tyree Phillips. It was Matt Parrott today.
I'm wondering if Tyree Phillips practiced or not, though.
Yeah, he might have not practiced today. I think that's actually what happened. So, but maybe he is the guy if he's playing. I'm not exactly sure about that, but yeah, it's an issue because Matt Parrott may be progressing in training camp or whatever. You may see some positive reports. The film has not been pretty for him in pass protection. I still think he can be a good run blocker. In pass protection, it's not pretty. And if you're out there as a liability in pass protection, what did we see? Was it the Baltimore game or the Arizona game from a couple years ago?
Baltimore game where he gave up 3 sacks in a row. Well, some of it was schemed specifically towards him.
Right. That was my point, though. Like, in that Baltimore game, you have a opposing defensive coordinator at the time, Wink Martindale, if I remember right, who's looking at the film being like, this dude has no chance in pass protection. Let's scheme specifically to attack him in pass pro. And he's not going to be the only coordinator who comes up with that type of stuff. So just don't feel comfortable about Parrott and pass protection. That makes me not feel comfortable about him as the swing tackle. I hope he's improved in that regard. It remains to be seen. The training camp, the preseason film with Parrott is going to be very important in that regard. Yes. We'll have to keep an eye on that, you and I, Nick, especially in pass pro. But yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at with him as a potential swing tackle option.
Again, so that was 2020 with the Matt Parrott thing. I'm not sure how many times Daniel Jones was sacked in that game, but Daniel Jones was just getting was he hurt?
He was hurt going into that series of games. Cardinals. Ravens. Jones was hurt with a high ankle, playing through a high ankle, and then getting absolutely destroyed, a hamstring, and then getting absolutely destroyed by his right tackle out there. Like, we don't need to go over this. We already know this. One of the best things we like about Jones is his toughness. I mean, this dude is such a tough competitor. That was a crazy stretch of games for Jones coming back in that season.
And Dan, honestly, we don't talk about this enough. Like, we critique Jones's skill set and some of the stuff that we would like for him to improve on tape. But his toughness and the work ethic are two things that I think Joe Schoen has circled. And that's not ubiquitous. That's not everywhere. You think it is among quarterbacks, but how many like horror stories have you heard from other fan bases about their quarterbacks not putting in the necessary work or kind of checking out once they get hit? Daniel Jones, he has neither of those issues. Neither of those issues are within his wheelhouse, man, because Daniel Jones works his ass off and he's tough as nails.
Yeah, he doesn't see ghosts. One final thing, no ghost for Daniel Jones. One final thing I didn't bring up, just want to talk about real quick. One of the Hyatt touchdowns, the ball Jones threw on the one where he was rolling a little bit out of the pocket, moving to his right, and then reset. He did reset his feet, so it's not fully off platform. But what I mean by that is the shoulders are not squared on that throw. When you have squared shoulders into a throw, it's a lot easier to deliver it on target with velocity and on time. When your shoulders aren't squared like they weren't in that clip for him, I love the way that he could change the trajectory on the football while maintaining velocity and ball placement down the field, not in the short, not in intermediate, while having his shoulders basically flipped toward the target, which makes it a much more difficult throw for the quarterback in this regard. So I thought that was a really interesting throw by Jones. I thought the arm talent on that one was really impressive.
Bro, he almost outthrew Jalin Hyatt.
Yeah.
On that throw. Like that was a very impressive throw. Like Jalin Hyatt had to extend, and great job by him to concentrate and pluck that out of the air. Something maybe we didn't focus enough on. I know we brought up a little bit earlier in the podcast, but him coming out of Tennessee, we acknowledged it, but so far through camp, his hands have been very impressive.
that was something you brought up. And I looked after my first review of him when we did the discussion. You said that, and I was like, you know what? I want to give this a second look. And I watched a little bit more, and I was like, I do like that. The hands are better because I still don't think he's the most physical receiver at the contact point, and that could have hurt him at some point. I still am concerned about post catch creativity, not post catch in space. If he has a lane, I think he can take it. But the hands are big. When you can pluck away from frame, when you can come down with and not drop those passes, it's the difference between like a Darius Slayton type and like, let's think of another version of that doesn't have drop issues, like whoever that would maybe be, like maybe not going to compare the two, but not a Jalen Waddle. That's not a fair.
That's the guy I was thinking of.
Yeah,
personally.
but
that's another level. That's another level.
Yeah.
So I'll say this: the play from college that. And if anybody wants to check it out, I have a bunch of his clips on our Twitter. It's if you scroll down, it doesn't have a lot of views because it kind of got silenced
on the YouTube.
The YouTube. I said Twitter. I'm sorry. Yeah, on the YouTube. It got silenced by YouTube for copyright reasons, which is fine. But it's fine. Like it's allowed to be posted, but you can't monetize on the video, but it also suppresses it. But if anybody wants to see like all of his highlights, all of his explosive plays, we have it. Just scroll down the feed and you'll find it. All of the explosive plays from every year that Jalin Hyatt played at Tennessee.
It's a fun watch. If you just want to kill a few minutes, it's a fun watch.
And I also put his introductory press conference over it, so you can also listen to that as you're watching him kick ass in college. But the play that really stuck out to me from his senior season was the Missouri play, which you'll see on that play. It was the one where it was like a deep post. He just kind of shake the defender, broke over the middle of the field. There was no safety there. And the throw was a little bit towards his inside, and he had to track it into his hands. And he didn't score the touchdown. He got tackled at like the 2 or 3 yard line. But the tracking was the one thing that I was like, that's a very impressive catch. Yes. Very difficult catch when you're running that way and the ball is thrown inside and you don't flip your hips around to contort. You actually just like kind of look up and just try to adjust your hands behind yourself as your momentum's going in the exact opposite direction. Very difficult catch. And that was one of the plays that really stuck out to me from his college tape.
That's always been, in my opinion, one of the most hard to quantify but important traits to evaluate a wide receiver by when you're looking at his tape coming from college to the NFL. Ball tracking on the vertical plane. I love Hyatt's ability to track the ball. I loved it with Josh Palmer previously in previous classes. I think it's a really important trait that doesn't often get discussed because it's not easy to quantify by like a 40-yard dash or like whatever, combine stats or the numbers, the yards after the catch, like things you can look at for other traits. You can look into those types, then catch rate, all that stuff. It doesn't really have a metric yet for it. It's kind of just eye test film, but ball tracking is incredibly important on the vertical plane. I think Hyatt does a really good job of that. I want to say one more thing before we go. I feel like from looking at just the film that Giants have posted to their accounts, and credit to like Bobby Skinners of the world and Giants Take Podcasts of the world who are taking videos, though I know now you're like shut down from taking them at camp or whatever, that we've had a lot more wow throws from the quarterback position than we've had in a training camp in a really long time for the Giants. And that's something interesting to me. I don't want to make too much of it, but you talked about we talked earlier. I love the throw to Hyatt that I just discussed where he's rolling to his right. I know he has a chance to reset his feet, but the shoulders are not squared and he just rips that thing downfield. I love the tight window throw to Hyatt from a few practices ago by the sideline where he kind of fits that in the window Jones and puts it right on Hyatt, who catches it, drags his feet. I feel like we're getting a lot more wow throws from the quarterback position than we've had in a while. And that could be something that translates hopefully to the regular season.
It seems like that. There's a lot more excitement, and for good reason. Last year, we entered the season like, hey, we got a new coach. Let's see what happens. Yeah, we were a little bit more optimistic than many others, but in training camp, we weren't overly optimistic because remember, man, like Daniel Jones was getting his ass kicked. Everything was so negative surrounding the Giants offense, but we just trusted Mike Kafka coming from Kansas City and Brian Dable coming from Buffalo, and then they exceeded our expectations. But now we're going in like, hey, we won a playoff game. We could make the playoffs again. The schedule's a little bit but difficult. We'll go over our predictions a little bit later on, but there's much more optimism surrounding the Giants. And I also just feel like the Giants social media team, credit to them. I think they're doing an excellent job covering training camp and also bringing the fun vibes by like interviewing the players with these creative questions. I think they're doing a great job.
Yeah. Shout out to the Giants social media team. Hook us up with something. I don't know what it is. Give us something. I don't know. All right. That's all we have for today on the Big Blue Banter podcast. Keep it locked and loaded. Thank you. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.